1 million people dead, another million gone, villages emptied, fields rotting, families boarding ships so crowded and diseased they would later be remembered as coffin ships. In the winter of 1846, across Ireland, people dug into black soil and pulled up what looked like survival, only to watch it collapse into a foul-smelling paste in their hands. The crop was the potato, cheap, humble, ordinary, and when it failed, an entire society cracked open. That is the part most people remember, if they remember potatoes as history at all. Famine, hunger, desperation. But that is not the beginning of the story. It is the moment the world discovered, in the cruelest possible way, what the potato had already become. Not a side dish, not peasant filler, not a bland little tuber sitting quietly on a dinner plate. A force, a compact machine for turning land into people, calories into labor, and fields into power. But the story doesn't start in Ireland. It starts high in the Andes, where the air is thin, the nights are brutal, and one of history's most important crops learned how to survive. About 8,000 years ago, in the highlands around Lake Titicaca, in what is now Peru and Bolivia, people began domesticating wild potatoes. Not in gentle farmland, but in a punishing environment of frost, altitude, stone, and uncertainty. That matters, because the potato was shaped by hardship from the beginning. It was not bred in abundance. It was bred in risk. Andean farmers learned which tubers were edible, which were bitter, which could survive the cold, which could be stored, and which would poison you if you handled them wrong. Over generations, they transformed a wild plant into a civilization crop. Not glamorous, not ceremonial in the way gold was ceremonial. More important than that, reliable, dense with calories, rich in vitamin C, easy to grow in harsh terrain where grain would struggle. And then they did something even more extraordinary. They found a way to make it last. In the Andes, people developed chuno, a freeze-dried potato made by exposing tubers to freezing night temperatures and drying sun, then trampling and pressing out moisture until the potato could be stored for years, sometimes far longer. Think about that for a second. This was food engineering on a civilizational scale. Long before industrial supply chains, refrigeration, or modern packaging, Andean societies had created a shelf-stable survival ration from mountain frost and sunlight. This is where the potato stops being a crop and starts becoming a system. The Inca world ran on roads, labor, storehouses, and state coordination across huge vertical landscapes. Potatoes fit that world perfectly. They could feed communities in difficult terrain. They could be stored, transported, rationed, planned around. When empires expand, they need food that travels through bureaucracy as well as through stomachs. The potato could do both. Then the Spanish arrived. In the 16th century, conquistadors marched into the Andes looking for silver, souls, and submission. What they saw first was empire in stone. What they missed, at least at first, was empire in the soil. Gold dazzled them. The potato did not. But empires are often built less by what rulers admire than by what they can use. Somewhere in the second half of the 1500s, the potato crossed the Atlantic into Europe as part of the Columbian Exchange, that violent planetary reshuffling of plants, animals, diseases, peoples, and wealth. The same process that sent horses and wheat westward sent potatoes eastward. And like many things taken from the Americas, the potato arrived stripped of context. Europeans had the plant, but not yet the cultural logic to understand it. At first, it looked suspicious. It grew underground. It belonged to the nightshade family. It did not appear in the Bible. It had none of the symbolic prestige of bread and none of the visual familiarity of grain. In some places, it was treated as animal feed. In others, as a curiosity, a botanical oddity, something foreign, maybe useful, maybe dangerous. But history does not care about first impressions. It cares about performance. And the potato performed. It yielded far more food per acre than many old world staples. It could grow in poor soils. It produced calories with ruthless efficiency. Unlike grain, it did not require complex milling before it could feed a household. And most importantly, it grew underground. That meant it was harder for raiders to seize, harder for armies to burn, and easier for peasants to hide. In an age of war, tax pressure, and unstable harvests. That was not a minor advantage. It was strategic. This is where everything began to escalate. By 1650, potatoes were established in the Low Countries. By the 18th century, they had spread through Germany, Prussia, and Poland. By the 1840s, they were in Russia. In Ireland, they took root especially fast. By the end of the 17th century, the potato was already a major crop there. And for the poor, it was more than a crop. It was the difference between surviving on tiny plots and not surviving at all. The reason was brutally simple. The potato let landlords divide land into ever smaller holdings while still extracting rents and grain for market. Families who could no longer live well on cereal crops could still stay alive on potatoes. Barely, but alive. A tiny patch of ground could feed more people with potatoes than with wheat or oats. That sounds like a blessing. In practice, it also made exploitation scalable. It didn't just help people endure the system. It helped the system stretch further than it should have. Across Europe, the effects were enormous. Historians have argued that the potato accounted for roughly a quarter of Old World population growth and urbanization between 1700 and 1900. A quarter. That is not a food trend. That is a demographic engine. More calories meant more children surviving, more laborers moving to towns, more soldiers marching, more miners digging, more factory workers standing through 14-hour shifts, more states able to tax, conscript, and expand. The potato did not create modern Europe by itself, but it helped feed the bodies that built it. And once rulers understood that, the relationship changed. In Prussia, Frederick the Great pushed potato cultivation because states had learned a hard lesson. Food security was not just about mercy. It was about military resilience. A population that could eat was a population that could work, pay, and fight. A crop that survived invasion better than visible grain was not merely agriculture. It was policy. That decision looked small at the time, a king encouraging a tuber. But behind it was a new kind of political logic. The modern state was learning to see crops as instruments of administration. To govern food was to govern survival itself. If you're enjoying this kind of deep history, subscribe, because the most ordinary things usually carry the darkest stories. And then the story turned dark. By the early 1840s, nearly half the population of Ireland, especially the rural poor, depended heavily on the potato. Some families consumed astonishing quantities every day because the potato, often with a little milk, kept them alive on scraps of land. The very quality that made the potato so powerful, its productivity, had encouraged dependence. And dependence had encouraged sameness. Potatoes are often propagated not by seed in the ordinary sense, but by planting pieces of tuber or clones of previous plants. That makes it easy to preserve desired traits. It also makes entire food systems genetically fragile. In Ireland, heavy reliance on just one or two major varieties created a trap. When late blight arrived in 1845, caused by Phytophthora infestans, the system had no resilience. The leaves blackened. The fields stank. Tubers rotted in storage. The crop failed again in 1846 and again in the years that followed. But blight alone did not create the catastrophe. Policy did. Power did. Ireland, under British rule, was still exporting food even as hunger devoured the countryside. Grain, livestock, and other commodities continued moving out while the people who had grown them starved beside empty potato ridges. Relief efforts came, stalled, were reshaped, withdrawn, debated, moralized over. Bureaucracy moved slower than hunger. Ideology proved harder than mercy. And so the potato became a mirror, showing the world what happens when a crop becomes the only buffer between poverty and death. Around 1 million died. Another 1 to 2 million emigrated. The population of Ireland collapsed. Its politics changed. Its memory changed. Its diaspora changed cities across Britain, the United States, Canada, and beyond. The potato did not just sit at the center of that history. It was the center through which land, class, empire, and indifference all converged. This is the irony that never quite leaves the potato. It fed the poor because it was efficient. Then that very efficiency made the poor more vulnerable. And yet the story does not end in the graveyard or at the dock. Because modernity did what modernity always does. It absorbed the lesson, kept the crop, and industrialized the logic. In the centuries that followed, the potato became one of the world's most important food crops, eventually ranking fourth globally behind wheat, rice, and maize. It moved far beyond village survival. It became starch for industry, alcohol for distilling, feed for armies, calories for cities, and eventually raw material for mass consumer culture. The potato became fries in paper cartons, chips in shiny bags, flakes in boxes, frozen products in global cold chains. It moved from peasant field to factory line to drive-through window. One of history's great famine crops became one of history's great processed foods. And that transformation tells you something unsettling about the modern world. We did not merely keep the potato because it was nourishing. We kept it because it was controllable. Standardized varieties, predictable shapes, mechanized harvesting, uniform slices, supply contracts, branded salt, portion economics. The potato entered the age of corporations the way it once entered the age of empires, by being incredibly useful to larger systems. But usefulness has a cost. Today, when most people think of potatoes, they think of carbs, comfort food, maybe guilt. They do not think of biodiversity, even though Peru alone still preserves thousands of native varieties in extraordinary colors, shapes, and flavors. They do not think of Andean communities who spent centuries breeding resilience into this crop. They do not think of how dangerous monoculture remains, or how plant disease and climate stress still haunt global agriculture. They do not think of the fact that the same crop that once helped power population booms is still central to food security in many parts of the world. You can still see the old story inside the new one. The potato remains a battle between diversity and standardization, between local knowledge and industrial scale, between nourishment and dependency, between what feeds people well and what feeds systems efficiently. That is why it keeps reappearing at the center of questions far bigger than food: how we farm, who controls seed, what we subsidize, what we market, and what kinds of vulnerability we quietly build into everyday life. Because the potato was never just a potato. It was a mountain crop domesticated by people whom imperial histories long treated as peripheral, then stolen into a global exchange that enriched empires. It was a hidden ration that could outlast war. It was a peasant staple that helped states grow stronger. It was a miracle of calories that became a machine for cheap labor. It was salvation in one century and a death sentence in another. It fed miners, tenants, factory workers, migrants, soldiers, and schoolchildren. It filled royal policy papers and famine pits. It survived suspicion, crossed oceans, changed diets, shifted population curves, and entered the bloodstream of modern capitalism. So the next time you see a potato dusted with soil in a market crate, mashed beside a steak, cut into fries at midnight, or forgotten in the back of a cupboard, see it for what it really is. Not an ordinary food, but an artifact of empire, ecology, hunger, invention, and survival. A small underground storage organ that altered the fate of continents. That is the eerie genius of history. Sometimes the objects that seem most mundane are the ones that moved the most people, carried the most power, and revealed the most about how civilization actually works.